Hello, everybody, and welcome to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association. And today on ICMDA webinars, we have Marion Knell speaking to us on the subject of avoiding burnout. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Marion Knell and the subject of avoiding burnout. Long an occupational hazard amongst social workers, burnout is a growing problem among those on the front lines, including aid workers, medical professionals, legal services providers, and resettlement volunteers. Those experiencing burnout are putting not just themselves, but their clients in danger. And in Christian circles particularly, an overemphasis on servanthood has ignored other biblical values such as rest and refreshment. This session is going to look at the causes of burnout and compassion fatigue, then explore preventative strategies for individuals and organizations. Having been on the leadership of Member Care Europe and Global Member Care, Marion Knell designed and instituted an MA in the subject. She now consults with European Freedom Network and Refugee Highway Partnership on care for refugees, refugee workers, and the mental health of refugee children. She's developed and recorded a course for workers and churches on working with traumatized refugees and sustaining refugee workers, which has received CPD certification. Marion teaches regularly with Christian Medical Fellowship UK, the affiliated UK body of ICMDA, and she's currently delivering a course into Ukraine on receiving soldiers back from war. Marion, it's such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say and to interacting with you afterward. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm not sure how to live up to all that, but anyway, thank you. As people will realise, this is, if you will pardon the expression, a hot topic, burnout. Back in 2008, there were over 6,000 books on the subject. And most recently, there's been a burnout report by the Mental Health UK, which came out in 2024 this year. So Maslach and Leiter, who did all the main research on this and indeed produced a paper on burnout, 35 years of research and practice, say this: workers have too little time and too few tools with which to handle their workload. Non-profit employees have high expectations and are attempting to solve truly monumental problems. Their idealism can lead them to overextend themselves and take on too much. Dr. Rachel Andrew follows up by saying, it can be quite functional, the only way your body and mind have left to keep you safe, of protecting you when there are no other options available. But it's not a decision you make. It happens unconsciously. And I want to stress during this webinar the importance of teams or organizations in the role of preventing burnout. Because people who are in burnout are not aware of it, it's really important that there are others around them who can detect that and bring it to their notice and begin to deal with something that might help. So we're going to start off by looking at the human performance and strengthening and health curve. I'm always a bit hesitant about doing this with doctors and dentists around, but anyway, medical folk, here it is. So we've got our two axes of functioning and stress, and without any stress, we don't get out of bed in the morning. My son used to have a poster on his wall saying, without stress, my life would be empty. So a little bit of stress, we're frustrated, under-involved, but as it increases, actually our creative juices kick in, and we come to that point of peak performance and health, which will be different for each of us, the amount of stress that brings us to that point and makes us that whole person. But too much stress sends us on the other side of the curve that we have there. Marked by increased tiredness, being indecisive, decreased performance, and physical and mental illness. And at the bottom of the curve is burnout. Now, what we do know is that people can spend some time in what I call the red sector, that bit to the right of the peak performance. You can spend some time in there as long as you go back and recover, regenerate, refresh, and have that time to do recovery. Otherwise, you're on that slippery slope. And one of the important things for people in terms of preventing burnout is understanding stress and stress in themselves. Now, again, here we are in the medical world, but common signs of stress. I wonder where you identify with these as you read them. Physical, sleeplessness, that's me. Loss of appetite, overeating, headaches, fatigue. Our emotional responses to stress, depression, disorientation, defensiveness, irritability. Ask my husband and he'll tell you that's me. Feeling overwhelmed. And finally, behavioral responses, withdrawing, overindulgence, loss of a sense of humor. Yes, I can tick that one. And the inability to make decisions. So when I used to train people who were making cross-cultural transitions, we always asked 4 questions. How do you know when you're stressed? What can you do to help yourself? How do others know when you're stressed? What can they do to help? So increasing the awareness of stress and its effects. And I just wondered, perhaps you might want to put some things in the chat box here. What do you think are the particular sources of stress for health workers in the physical, mental, emotional, and organizational arenas? And maybe we'll be able to pick those up in a minute. I should only be able to pick up the ones that are English. But just think, what do you think are signs that are particularly to your area? Ali Chen says this, the way I describe it is, you're like a vessel of water with many different little cups to fill in during the day. If you're empty, you have nothing to give them. Now, we haven't got a lot of time today to look at compassion fatigue, but exploring compassion fatigue is one important way of preventing people going all the way down that slope. So Eva Ekman says this about compassion fatigue. Hearing people's traumatic stories can generate feelings of compassion, gratitude, and purpose. But it can also cause care providers to mirror sufferers' emotions, an experience called vicarious trauma. Compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma leads to burnout when we are not able to recover, when there's not emotional resilience. And we're going to look at resilience and its preventative role later on. But becoming aware of our limitations when we are in those caring, compassion roles. With my refugee workers, we always say that we set up a debriefing, a de-rolling at the end of a particularly difficult day. If they've been listening to some really hard stories, we train them so that there can be a peer debriefing where somebody else from the team will listen to the story and help the person reflect on the day. And at the end of that, the person then goes back and does a self-identifying. So at the end of the day, I say, my name's Marion Knell. I'm married to Brian. I've got 3 children. I'm a child of God. And then I don't take that person's pain and stories back with me. They don't become mine. They're not mine. They're theirs. And signs of compassion fatigue, again, helpful for a team to have a handle on this. Difficulty managing your emotions. So you have outbursts or there is inappropriate sharing with your client. Difficulty making good decisions. Problems managing boundaries between yourself and others. Time and again, boundaries come up as the preventative mechanism or a preventative mechanism in avoiding burnout. Problems in relationships, Physical problems, the body responding to this excess stress. Difficulty feeling connected to what's going on around and within you, and a loss of meaning and hope. Now, when we come to define burnout, which we have to do, we can't avoid something if we don't know what it is, that becomes very much an exacerbated symptom. So again, you might like to think, I hope you'll do some self-reflection during this webinar. Have you recognized any of these symptoms in yourself or in somebody you've worked with? So let's look at what burnout is if we're going to avoid it. So here's a standard, if you like, definition of it. So a state of emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. It occurs when you feel overwhelmed, unable to meet constant demands, lose interest and motivation, feeling detached and depressed. I'll just read that again. A state of emotional, all three realms, mental and physical exhaustion, being spent, caused by excessive and prolonged stress. It occurs when you feel overwhelmed, unable to meet constant demands, and that's where we'll be thinking about organizations, lose interest and motivation, feeling detached and depressed. And there are 4 stages of burnout. So the first stage is energy shortage. And as we've said, if you think about compassion fatigue, there's a layover into this. So the symptoms at stage 1, exhaustion, loss of energy, feelings of weariness not relieved with normal stress. In other words, you can't just take a day off and you'll be better. Denial, there is no problem. Again, this is where teams come in. The person who is going on that stage of burnout, you say, how are you? I'm fine, which we do anyway too much as Christians, but there's no problem. A detachment, emotional detachment, stepping back from any engagement with the work or ministry. Having no satisfaction with the work or ministry. And within the community, sarcastic verbal contempt for others or the work or the ministry. And this is not just about having a bad day. This is long term. And people, let's have a look at number 2. Chronic symptoms, bad behaviors, developing slowly or lasting for a long time. So as I say, not a bad day, but a repeated experience. And at this point, we have a narrowness of viewpoint from loss of perspective and narrowing of options. Nothing's going to change. This is terrible. I can't, there's a lack of perspective. It's not seen in a bigger picture. It's all narrowed down. Anger and a sense of not being appreciated. Intense fear or suspicion, usually unfounded, of the work, people, etc. People get preoccupied with how they're being treated and attribute wrong motives. And finally, here we have the real down at the bottom, disorientation, separation from the world around them, concentration, thought processes, judgment, decision-making are all impaired. Now, that's really important if you think about the key areas that the people that you are involved in, that I'm involved in, the inability to make good decisions or think through things means that when they switch off, they are not only a danger to themselves, but they are a danger to their client. And then stage 3, crisis, where there's a deep, abiding negativity in a sense that things cannot and will not change, where they feel trapped and there is no way out. And finally, the crash, where there's a deep sense of hopelessness, an individual's career and life is in danger, and suicide may be considered as the only option left. Now, I'm going to put questions up as we go through this talk, and hopefully you might be able to use them with your teams. Do you recognize any of these in yourself or anyone you have worked with? What measures were taken to help? I see we've got one answer in the chat box from our last emotional and organizational stresses. Thank you, Virginie, for that. I wonder how many of you have worked with someone who was in that state of burnout. This is what others have said. It's important to be affected by the work we do with survivors, but equally not to be infected. Again, that's what we talked about with that de-rolling, that yes, we need empathy, we need to be affected, but we can't internalize it. Someone else said, I felt it a privilege that someone who was damaged was prepared to share with me, and this had a major impact on me. I recognized the need for more training, and I put down more boundaries, and I know this came from supervision. So I think it's quite helpful to look at what's the difference between stress and burnout? When does the shift happen? In stress, people are over-engaged with the ministry, with what's happening. Burnout, people disengage. You pull back, you go through the motions. In stress, our emotions are overreactive. We flare up quickly, whereas in burnout, our emotions are blunted. In stress, it's urgency, hyperactivity. In burnout, helplessness and hopelessness. In stress, the loss is a loss of energy, whereas in burnout, it's a loss of motivation and ideals. And we're not going to touch terribly much on the spiritual side of things, but there are definite spiritual challenges in terms of worldview in this. In stress, we get anxiety disorders. In burnout, it's detachment and depression. So in stress, the primary damage is physical and may kill prematurely because people may have a stroke or heart attack. In burnout, the primary damage is emotional because it may make life not worth living, and therefore suicide becomes an option. I hope I'm not going too fast for our translators. Doubtless they will. Oh, here we are. Time out, sabbatical, reducing hours, protecting work-home boundaries, developing hobbies, CBT and other counselling. Thank you very much. That's really helpful. So what are the causes of burnout? Because we're talking today about avoiding it. So if we know what causes it, we can hopefully avoid all these things. And I've put them into three areas. So work, people feeling out of control. And the real question is, who controls the schedule? Does the schedule control you, or do you control your schedule? Lack of recognition, no recognition of what's being done. An unclear, over-demanding job expectations. The number of times I hear that. And particularly unclear, people being recruited for a role then find out that they're actually not doing that. And therefore there's a complete mismatch and they can't ever meet or satisfy their bosses. Monotonous tasks, chaotic or high pressure environment. Now, for me, in my context, that's refugee workers in refugee camps, where it's a totally chaotic and high pressure environment, and where getting away is impossible in the camp. You actually have to take time off away. Secondly, personality traits, perfectionism, pessimistic view of self and world, needing to be in control, the high achievers. And lastly, lifestyle, the whole lifestyle, which you do have control of, overworking, no relaxation, too much expected by too many, taking too much responsibility without help, insufficient sleep, lack of close supportive relationships. Time and again, relationships figure in people surviving, being healthy. And the effects of burnout on a team are these. Once you've got that infection, anger towards managers, lack of initiative, people become very passive. You have a clique formation, the inner and outer circles becomes exclusions, conflict between the groups, high turnover of personnel. I was at a Christian retreat once, and there was somebody from a very well organization, and he said, well, everybody knows that anyone in my job burns out in 5 years. And I said to him, and that's acceptable? And he said, oh, yes. Well, there you go. Negative attitudes towards the workplace, critical attitudes towards colleagues, and scapegoat mentality, trying to find somebody to blame for it. Well, here we are. We're coming now to the word prevention. Accept that it's impossible to care for others without caring for yourself. That's a very difficult one in Christian circles, and particularly in some Christian cultures where self-care is deemed to be selfish. And there isn't really an understanding of biblical self-care. I was in Eastern Europe about 6 months ago, where very much the pastor is expected to work 7 days a week, and anything else is not acceptable. But the biblical principle that God created man on day 6 and man rested on day 7 meant that he rested in order to work. He didn't work in order to rest, that absolute principle. Understand that stress is inherent in most work, and the high demands of everyone cannot always be met. Again, the danger to people who are people pleasers, who find it really hard to say no. Overwork, long hours, lack of support influence stress levels. Sometimes people are doing a job for which they do not have adequate support. And the prevention of maintaining and protecting a team spirit in an atmosphere where feelings can be expressed. An atmosphere that's not judgmental, that if somebody expresses a vulnerability, they're not immediately talked down to it or given a spiritual verse, a verse from the Bible, which means they just need to get out of it. But the importance of that team being there for each other and recognizing things. So prevention, know yourself. Recognize your stress symptoms, your limits, admitting that you have limits. Again, particularly in the Christian world, we have people who have what I call a Messiah complex, and they go out to save the world and forget that somebody's already done that. But knowing that it is not my mission, it's God's mission. Practicing self-care, understanding your stressors, know your limits and incompetence, energy, commitments, communicate, know your needs, and take care of them. I just wonder how many organizations do stress briefings when their people come. What do they think the stresses are going to be in this location, in this job? How do you cope with stress at the moment? How do you think you might cope in the future? But just opening that up to people as they join us, so that it becomes an area where we're putting in good practices so that they can't fall foul of the things that we've talked about. So how do people take care of themselves? I wonder how you take care of yourself. A healthy lifestyle, very basic: eating, sleeping, relaxation, and exercise. Again, in some locations, there's a challenge to that exercise, that side of things, and we need to think how we can do that. Setting boundaries, the work-life balance. Having supportive relationships. And I think building relationships where you are, I've noticed that because of social media, that some people who go overseas to work are remaining so connected back home that they're not building relationships in the location in which they are, where there's then an immediate support. Having self-care groups, people, small groups that you talk with. Creativity, exploring your creative nature. And that's not just painting. I can't draw to save my life, but I can write. Relax, reading, music, nature. What relaxes you? Learn to say no. Just because I can do something doesn't mean to say I should, and having a sense of humor. So again, some comments on this. I felt I couldn't stop helping because people needed me. My family and friends found it hard to talk to me. I became frustrated and angry with normal life. I felt like shouting, "Don't you know what's happening out there?" And again, here's another question for you to park or to talk with your team. How much has previous experience with clients impacted you? And Essex Lettieri says, oh, sorry, I've gone too many. It's the hardest thing to turn away somebody who's knocking at your door when desperation is written all over their face. But managers have to understand that we have to do that in order to serve people at all. It's not just about protecting the workforce, but also ensuring the quality of work for the client. And that goes back to what we said at stage 2 of burnouts, where people actually become a danger to the people they're working with rather than a help. And I just wanted very briefly to look at Jesus, because if Jesus needed to practice self-care, then obviously we do. But Jesus had boundaries in his relationships. We haven't got time to do a Bible study, but I'll just say that the relationships, the first one is about relationships with the family. The reserves is the story of the 5 foolish and 5 wise virgins. And the ones that were wise were because they knew their capacity. They either said, come on, let us have some of yours. And they said no. And they knew that if they let them have it, their supplies would be totally exhausted. So conserving reserves. With the authorities, they demanded a miracle, and he didn't provide it. Self-preservation. He stays away from Judea because it's a dangerous place for him at that point of time. He refused to be manipulated. Peter tries to manipulate him. Delegation. Jesus was very good at delegation. This is the 5,000, but there are numerous occasions when he sent other people out to do it. And his capacity, he said, I do nothing by myself. And then the 4 S's. Solitude. Jesus went off by himself. He left the crowds. There were crowds, but he didn't feel that he needed to be there all the time or necessarily here on. He went away on his own and spent time with his Father. He socialized. He was almost a party animal. He went to people for meals. He spent time that was not ministry related. He had support. He had the women who traveled with him who looked after his needs. Very interesting to think, well, what would these women have been doing with this group? And then he had significant others, the 3, the small group with whom he could be totally open and vulnerable, the significant others. So now another question for you. Am I modeling self-care? If not, why not? Am I resting? What goals can I set myself? How do we promote good self-care in our teams? Which leads us on to talking about the role of organizations in the prevention of burnout. We've alluded to this, but often the structure and ethos of the organization does not permit people to live within sensible and sustainable boundaries and lifestyles. So clarifying objectives and roles, I've already referred to that, no mismatch. Mentoring, training people in self-care. Some people come from a background or a culture where the idea of taking care of yourself just isn't there, or indeed taking care of each other. Training managers to understand stress. Improve the work processes. What processes are there for people to be able to manage their workload? Enhance working conditions where possible. Again, within the refugee camps, that's a huge challenge. What can you do to make these places a more sustainable place to live? Training teams in listening skills. Not everybody is a natural listener. Some people are natural talkers. Not everyone's a natural listener, but train the teams to listen to each other and to be there for each other. Encourage outside support networks. Encourage people to have supportive relationships, networks outside of the workplace. Provide psychological support. Really important, I think, in preventing burnout, that people have regular debriefing, that you have somebody on your team who can do debriefing, or that you teach peer debriefing, which is quite popular these days, and that it's regular. Appraisals are really important. Appraisals aren't to find fault with people. They are a way of actually just reviewing what the year was like, but don't leave it to the last minute till they've been there 5 years to start doing this. Improve communication. And very often managers have to take the initiative on that. Control the schedule, control your schedule. And managers can be role models. One of the hardest things, if you've got a manager who's a workaholic, who's there at his desk till 9 o'clock in the evening, it's very hard for people who are further down the ladder to say, no, it's time. I need to go home and spend time with my family. I need time to relax. I need 1 day a week off. Really important that managers model good self-care. So again, a load of questions. What stress briefings have you had? What monitoring system is in place in your organisation? What lines of communication and access to help have been set up? What forms of debriefing are you equipped to provide? How do you monitor your personal work-life balance? And this next page is really I'm not going to go through this again, but it's a summary of the questions that we've set so far, again, which I hope you will spend time afterwards musing on, using in your teams, working through. And before we leave prevention, I do just want to talk a little bit about recovery, because recovery from burnout is really difficult. It takes a long time. People decompress, get away. It's no good just getting away for a week. Burnout takes a long time to recover, and probably means getting right away from the situation. Rest, eat, sleep. I always love the story of Elijah, where he's had it, he's burnt out, and then God just lets him sleep. He sends a raven to feed him. He doesn't berate him. Relax, do some fun things. Talk. Find a safe place and qualified person. Have access in your organisation to professionals. Reflect. The people that did the research on post-traumatic growth talked about the importance of rumination, reflection in recovery. Connect with others. Celebrate small successes and mourn your losses. Again, often there's a grief issue here. And just to say that intervention must be made with delicacy and care to prevent the fragile self-esteem of the person. Intervention should never be punishment or judgmental, but rather with an emphasis towards restoring health and wholeness, acknowledge the losses, and learning self-care. Now, in our last few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about resilience and the role of resilience, because resilience is a key factor in preventing burnout, measuring, building resilience. There's a great book, if you haven't come across it, called Resilience in Life and Faith by Dr. Debbie Hawker and Tony Horsfall. So Debbie's a psychologist, and Tony comes from a pastoral background, but has written lots of devotionals. So it's both sides of that. And resilience comes from that Latin word resiliere, which is to spring back or to come back into shape. It's used in the area of metals. So a metal is put under stress, and how much load can it bear before it springs back into shape? The ability to rebound from severe stress. Flexibility, pliability, suppleness. This is where people who like order and rules find it hard to be resilient. Strength of character, toughness, hardness, adaptability. Or as the wonderful Marjorie Foyle once said, the capacity to take life as it is and to manage it in a healthy way. And somebody's taken that image of the metal to say, well, you've got the strength of the person, the strength of the metal, and the load, the amount of stress. But we need to remember, when we're talking at this, we're human, we have weaknesses, we have the capacity to grow, and we can learn from past experiences. So I just want to introduce you to this concept of four realms of resilience, taken from the book Trauma and Resilience. And they've identified 4 areas of resilience. People develop personal resilience when a strong sense of call, although I would like to define that, and we could spend all day talking about that, actively cope with stress, an ability to cope with distress. Here we are, flexibility, adaptability, emotional control, again, good social support network, and self-awareness. That's really come up in several things that we've talked about. They have emotional resilience when they're able to connect with each other, with others, and are intentional in doing so. Have strong social support, home, organization, friends, church, however that may manifest itself where they are. Persistence and healthy family relationships. Again, years ago, I used to spend time with families before they went overseas, talking about what it was like to parent a family in an international context. Physical resilience. Well, this is not really hard to see. Healthy exercise, eating, sleeping, coming up again, work-life balance, boundaries, rest, relaxation, restoration, understanding limitations. And spiritual resilience, when they have a personal theology of suffering. Boy, are we lacking that in the West. Exercise spiritual disciplines, are able to forgive, receive grace, accept vulnerability, have personal connection with God, and participate and receive from a worshiping community. Now, that book has a resilience questionnaire. All these self-assessment questionnaires are only worth anything insofar as you are honest, but it's very good. So just to sum up, burnout is life-threatening and carries the potential for death. Is reversible, but the recovery process takes time. Restoration usually occurs after getting out of the situation, requires more than stress management techniques, rather intervention by someone who can identify the process trapping the person. And then there's some resources, and I know you're going to be sent those. But I'm going to hand back, I think, to Peter. Is that right?
Thank you very much. It was incredibly comprehensive. So we've got a time for question and answer now with Marion. So to the questions, Marion, and just to start with a comment here, an anonymous comment, but they're saying more of a remark, but I don't think you particularly mentioned loss of autonomy and respect as a factor in stress and burnout. I think you did, but having worked in both missionary medical work and in the NHS, I had a stronger sense of moral injury, feeling that things shouldn't be like this in the NHS, the National Health Service in England, than in Africa. I can only attribute this to a combination of very high levels of expectation at every level and a system that is over-regulated but under-resourced. And I just wanted to pick up on that, Marion. I'm sure some people listening to this webinar will have thought, well, this is incredibly good and helpful, but in actual fact, the things that are causing me to move down this path are completely beyond my control. They're all under the control of other people, and I'm like a victim, with an inevitable result coming, because there's nothing I can change in my life to prevent it. So what would you say to people who are perhaps feeling like that?
Okay, I just wanted to mention that I hummed and hawed about putting moral injury and decided we didn't have the time, because often we're dealing with guilt and shame as a result of that, which is another factor in it. If people can recognize where the burnout's coming from, the sounds, then there are some times when you say, well, things are out of my control, when you just have to walk away from the situation. And as that quote I had said, that's the hardest thing to do. I think of my refugee situations where you can never meet every need. Doesn't matter if you work, if you did 8 days a week, you wouldn't solve it. So sometimes there has to be either a walking away or a bit more of an assertion. Now, it comes difficult when people are in situations where they actually economically need to do the work.
Yeah.
Then that becomes a greater problem. But I do think how you then spend the hours that you do have off is important. I don't think computers and iPads help us in this, that actually they are not relaxing. They don't really help us. So we need to think of what are healthy ways of relaxing and restoring, and what restores me, and what can I do to help restore me. And I think this, for people in that sort of situation too, these supportive relationships are really important. People with whom you can unburden yourself, who will pray for you. Not that prayer is the whole answer by any means, but other people who will gather around you and support you and be your advocate. That's the other thing. Within an organization, if you feel you're powerless, is there anybody else in the organization that you can go to who could be your advocate? I think one of the things that is happening in a lot of NGOs is that they are realizing that the rate of people leaving the organization because they can't cope is actually forcing them down a pathway of considering we need to look at our systems, because this is not sustainable. We can't have a workforce that's depleting like that. Does that help?
Yeah, no, very, very helpful. Question from Rachel Pickering here. Are there particular personality types that are more prone to burnout? You mentioned perfectionism on one of the slides, but perhaps to comment on internal factors that make us more vulnerable or susceptible.
Well, yes, perfection. I said the perfectionists, the high achievers, also the people pleasers because they can't say no, and also what very often the family background. Where you've been brought up. I mean, I think of my missionary kids where service, a lot of them said, well, service was the most important thing. The most important thing was that I burnt out for Jesus, that, I did everything. And that's an unhealthy theology. So you've got people within that realm that are not, and if they came under very authoritarian parents, people who don't want to rock the boat, stand up to the system. I think that all sort of plays into that.
Yeah, thank you. And you mentioned having a personal theology of suffering as being a protective thing. Could you perhaps, I know we gave you so little time to cover so much, but can you perhaps just enlarge a little bit about what you meant by a personal theology of suffering?
Well, I mean, I obviously come from a Western perspective of this, but there is generally, I'm not talking about a prosperity theology, but there is generally a theology here that if I'm in a sticky situation, never mind incredibly, that God's going to get me out of it. And so therefore, we do a whole thing on the MA on a personal theology of suffering, understanding that suffering is there in the Bible. It's not a if, it's a when. So I think in terms of our resilience, if we have an expectation that life should be comfortable, that God should work everything out, then these little thing that hits that, and then we're down in a slump. And so I think that for me, that's it. That knowing that God is in control. I mean, I don't want platitudes, but I do want a sense that God is faithful no matter what, and no matter how I see it now. And I know that I will not have the answer to some of my questions, because unanswered prayers are one this side of eternity, and I can live with that because God's in control. I mean, one of the things we've been teaching to Ukrainians, and it was amazing, yes, it was the art of lament, and working through a lament and writing our own lament. But that recognizes that suffering is a part of life and will be part of my life. And that doesn't mean God's deserting me.
Mm. Thank you. You've talked about the role of the scriptures too. You gave us a very helpful list of tips from the Gospels, from Jesus's own experience, really helpful. And also you alluded to the life of Elijah and his burnout and the way that God resuscitated him, if you like, with some quite simple interventions in a sense, food, drink, sleep, and a fresh empowering and so on. But any comments on particular parts of scripture that are useful for people facing this situation, or for people to give to others? I mean, you have hinted that sometimes the scriptures can be inappropriately used, but are there any passages with particular strength and relationship to this?
Yes, I would always say be careful how you use scripture. And when people are in a very vulnerable situation, don't manipulate them with scripture, obviously. I think it's Isaiah 61, the exchange at the cross, because there's a sense in there, I'm just going to look it up while I'm here, of Jesus giving new things in exchange for sad things, because it's all about this oil of beauty instead of ashes, yes. Oil of joy instead of mourning, garments of praise instead of despair, cities renewed, ruins restored. All of that to me, if you can ponder on that, because that's what Jesus brings us at the cross, that he's there to bring beauty for ashes. And I love that. I mean, one of the pictures I use is the kintsugi, Japanese pottery, kintsugi?
Yeah.
Where they mend.
The gold is used to
yes,
make
the gold is used to mend the cracks. So you can see the cracks, they're still there, but they are beautified. So that's one passage I would go to when the person's ready.
Yeah. Thank you. You talked about personality differences and the way that they might make one more susceptible. Any comment on cultural differences? And two aspects here. Are some cultural backgrounds more susceptible to burnout, is one question. But the other question is burnout as a phenomenon the same across all cultures, or does it vary in the way it presents itself?
Oh, that's a big question. Well, certainly shame honor cultures are a difficult one. If you admit to being less than you should be, that's a shame. And because those cultures are also group cultures, not individual, it's not just about me. I can be Marion here and it doesn't affect anybody else. In a shame honor culture, which of course you can't be. And so actually to open up that you're having difficulties, all of that is shameful. So very often there's a closing down of that. I think the other thing is that because in group cultures things are processed as groups, a lot of our Western models of dealing with things as individuals just don't cut the mustard in those. Sorry, that's an awful phrase to translate, but they just don't work in group cultures. So we have to think about how we might adapt those, because we might be talking with a team and you might talk about we. You'd use the word we all the time, even though there's only one person in that room to whom that applies. But you always talk about we. I realize that we all find it difficult because yesterday was a particularly difficult day because we had so many people there, and how are we going to cope with it? Knowing perfectly well that it's one person that you're talking about, and they all know it's one person. But the group owns the experience of the individual.
Yeah. A question from Dave Crick here, another a UK-based GP I know who's been very much involved in member care. He said, I've read that increased empathy not only improves the consultation, but also increases resilience and so protects the doctor. Is that correct in your experience?
The increases resilience.
Empathy, yeah.
That's an interesting one. It goes back to that affected and infected. I mean, we definitely need, if we're working with people who are suffering in any way, we have to have empathy. And that goes along with the ability to sit and listen. I know doctors don't have a lot of time, but sitting and listening. Whether it increases resilience, I don't know. I think more resilient people are better able to be empathetic, because I think more resilient people have got their boundaries in place and therefore have the capacity to listen without it draining their own feelings or their own emotional well-being, let's say. I don't know if Doctor would agree with that. The other thing, I think, I didn't mention it, but it's an interesting thing, is generational resilience. I think the UK study showed that there was much less resilience in the under 35s than there were in the over 50s. Now, that's partly the over 50s sort of almost a grin and bear it mentality, although I don't think that's as true as when I was much younger. But how do we build resilience in our young people who are much more likely to be blown over? Now, partly that's fractured families. There's all sorts of things we could go in there. But I think that's another interesting area to look at.
Thank you so much, Marion. Unfortunately, looks like we've run out of time, and there are more questions.
Oh dear.
It shows just how you've simulated people and have got them thinking. And I was particularly struck in your example of the life of Jesus, how first of all, Jesus did not attend to every need. There's a verse in Luke 5 which says that as the news spread about him, more and more crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. So Jesus, the Son of God himself, walked away from need because he recognized the importance of keeping boundaries. I think that's very striking, how much more we. But the other thing you mentioned that we haven't had time to unpack is the whole area of delegation. And I remember particularly not just Elijah's meltdowns, but Moses's serious meltdowns, which were all about trying to do everything himself rather than empowering and equipping others. Of course, that was Jesus's main priority, wasn't it, in those 3 years of ministry, was to equip and empower others and then leave them with the job. And I wonder how much suffering we foist upon ourselves because we're just trying to do everything ourselves that others should actually be doing.
Yeah, I think a good induction program. How do you help people get into a team? I'm aware that somebody talks about being trapped in their situation, and that's another sort of area that we could explore. But the more you can do to create a healthy workplace, a healthy culture, the more you're going to avoid these unfortunate and unnecessary, outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it just remains for me to say thanks so much again, Marion, for your time and preparation and delivery and just example. I know your life has been a testimony to looking after people facing these kind of challenges, and to all of you for coming along and joining us on ICMDA webinars. We look forward to seeing you again soon. May the Lord bless you.